Okay, so before we go further, I do want to sort of preview for you what we're going to talk about today. So here are the learning goals for our discussion. One is going to be to understand what boundaries are and to try and make a differentiation between professional boundaries and personal boundaries, which even in our introductions, we've already sort of touched on the two different kinds of relationships that we are all in. We're also going to practice some self-awareness and think about what are my boundaries to begin with. And then we're going to hope to increase your confidence in navigating and setting those boundaries. Now, before we go further, I'm actually going to volley back to Glenn and have her talk about the group agreements that are actually coming from the Levanto community, which are really just meant to be here in order for us to be our most present selves during this conversation.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Mayté. So the kind of Levanto, the whole purpose of it is these five pillars here. The idea of this community, this collective, is so that women of color can feel safe, seen, supported, less stressed, and more prepared to navigate life and become their best selves. And that's kind of the whole thing that we're going to achieve in this session, honoring those themes throughout it, making sure that all those things, if you don't feel those things, like also let us know at the end if that these things did not resonate with you, because it's kind of the whole outcome that we want to have together, both for the space and for this presentation. So that is kind of what we're leaning on and our pillars for today and always here at Levanto.
As promised, so the first part of this content is really about starting to talk about what boundaries are and using some shared vocabulary, because I do think that there are many different ways of thinking and talking about boundaries. And so this is me just presenting you with some thought behind that. So again, what are they? And in order to get down to the definition of boundaries, I'm actually going to have you all go through this thought exercise with me. So what you see before you is this sort of division between professional and personal relationships. And the question that I want you to think about is, if you were to describe either a professional relationship or a personal relationship, what would be the characteristics that you would include for these relationships? And so that's why on the side, what you see is in a professional relationship, for example, our relationships are typically assigned. What I mean by that is if we are working in whatever organization we're working with, and this applies whether you're working within an organization and are, let's say, a typically salaried employee. I think it also pertains to those of us that are maybe a bit more entrepreneurial in nature in terms of our work, and we have clients, right? And so what I mean to say here is that in a professional sphere, our relationships are assigned. So we don't always get to choose who is our supervisor. We don't always get to choose who is a colleague that we're sharing working space with, right? So those relationships typically in the workspace are assigned. Different from if you think about personal relationships, for example, for those of us in the room that are either related and or in a relationship in which you call yourselves your best friends, those relationships are typically chosen. I will also name the fact that because I've been in this discussion before in which people will say, we don't choose the family that we're born into, and that is accurate, obviously. And yet, what I would say is that in our personal sphere, we get to choose how we relate to the people with whom we share family dynamics with. And again, I want to recognize that that's not always the case. And there is still room to be able to set boundaries in a different way in our personal relationships in a way that we might not be able to do in the professional. Again, so generally speaking, a characteristic of personal relationships is that they are chosen. And a characteristic of professional relationships is that they are assigned. So again, thinking about building vocabulary or building what we talk about or how we define boundaries, this is not an exhaustive list, so this is just my offering to you. So boundaries can be the following. They can be guidelines for maintaining positive and supportive relationships with clients or with colleagues. They can be rules and limits a person creates for themselves, which you all have started to talk about already. They can be a clear understanding of the limits and responsibilities of your role as in this case, service provider from my sphere, but in whatever roles you all have. But they are defined, especially in a professional space, by the role or maybe even by a job description, right? So that's a way to think about how to define your role and start to define boundaries at work. And they are the space between a provider's work and personal life between personal and professional, sort of the discussion that we just had about the differences between professional selves or professional relationships and relationships in the personal sphere. More definitions of boundaries, and this one is very much connected to our discussion today, which is, again, boundaries before burning out, boundaries before burnout. So boundaries can be defined as self-identified professional practices used to guide fulfillment, growth, prevent burnout, and improve productivity. They are also, again, depending on the spheres that you all inhabit, I will say, as a school psychologist myself, as a person that dives into clinical spaces, there are a set of ethical behaviors that I have to follow in order to continue my licensing or continue my certification, right? And so there are, depending on your role, a set of ethical behaviors set forth by licensing boards and employers that protect the integrity and welfare of both the client and the employee so that therapeutic, in this case, work can partake. Often called ethical principles or codes of ethics, depending on the field. Boundaries can also be a line that marks the limits of an area. So this is a very sort of, I want to say sort of tangible definition of what a boundary is. So it can be defined as a dividing line. For example, if we're talking about geography or physical spaces, the eastern boundary of the wilderness, right? Or the boundary between one geographic space and another, right? Or they can be, again, borders, frontiers, a borderline, or a partition. So that is some of the ways that you can define boundaries. Now, if we think about, again, this idea of the workspace or the professional space, there are boundaries that we establish ourselves, and then there are the boundaries that are established for us. So I'm actually going to start backwards. If we're looking at professional boundaries that have been given to us, what I mean to say is, again, whatever the role dictates, or whatever sort of ethical guidelines you might have, depending on the role that you have or the organization in which you work, those things are set for you. Those are not things that you are deciding for yourselves. Does that make sense? And so I will say, again, using a clinical sphere as the example, psychologists, clinicians have ethical guidelines that talk about how much self-disclosure is appropriate. So when I talk about self-disclosure, then it means, what am I saying about myself in order to connect to my client, in order to have a therapeutic conversation? I recognize that not everybody in this room has those kinds of limitations. However, it does not mean that you don't have job descriptions or roles that tell you this is appropriate with the client and this is not appropriate with the client. So again, these things are given to you. When we're talking about self-identified established boundaries at work, it might be, and I found myself thinking about this when I was preparing to talk to you tonight. For example, the ability to work only 40 hours a week or only 50 hours a week, whatever that number is for you all. I recognize that that number fluctuates across fields, across roles. And what I'm inviting you to think about, though, is that there are sort of the established expectations, and maybe there's also a level of the expectation that isn't named, but that's something that you learn over time that, well, maybe actually 40 hours is not enough. It's actually 50 hours, but the job description says X. I recognize that that is different. It actually made me think about a time where I provided a sort of taking care of yourselves at work training with a consulting firm that specifically asked me not to say anything about how much time people spend at work. They knew that I was potentially going to come in and say, I think you should consider how much time you're actually spending at work and what the expectation is. And because of the type of organization that they were and how the culture of that organization, they did not want me to set a number limit because that's how they worked, right? And so I say that to you all again as an example of sort of the explicit guidelines and then maybe the not so explicit expectations, which have to do with the culture of an organization. And then we can add, again, the factors that sort of stipulate, well, what do I feel that I can actually provide or in which I can actually be productive? What does that mean for me? And again, I recognize that we don't always have the freedom to set those boundaries given the organizations in which we might work. Let's talk a little bit about what makes talking about boundaries important. Why are we talking about this? Why spend time discussing this together, right? So here's one quote that helps us think about this. Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. Another way of saying that is boundaries are what I need to be able to articulate or know about myself and to know about you as well in order for us to engage in relationship. Now, I know that this says love, But I think what I want to invite you to think about, though, is what is it that you need in order to be your best connector self, what have you, in relationship anywhere, whether it's at work or whether it's in your personal space. What might make holding boundaries difficult, right? And so Renee started to talk a little bit about this, but let's just break it down. So here's a list of potential reasons why holding boundaries might be difficult, both setting and holding them. We want to connect and help other people. We might have limited resources with excessive workloads, to switch that word up. There might be collective exhaustion or burnout. So wherever you're working, the team itself might be collectively exhausted and burnt out. And so everyone needs help, and it's hard to say no when everyone is in need. Setting boundaries can be exhausting in and of itself because there might be situations in which you're setting those boundaries over and over again. And that repetition can be exhausting. We have our own emotional needs, history, triggers, what have you, which we're going to talk a little bit more when we get to the awareness part of this discussion. Clients are trying to get their needs met. So depending on the work that we do, again, clients or colleagues are also trying to get their own needs met in the best ways that they know how. And so that is sort of a conflict that's happening. Everyone is just trying to get their needs met, in essence. We don't necessarily trust other people to do the jobs that we think we might need to or want to do. So again, I think that this also speaks to the culture within an organization that we might be working in, and that there might be situations where we've been given a lot of work and that makes us feel successful. We're getting positive feedback, what have you. And then sometimes what ends up happening, which I've also seen in workplaces, is that the people that do a really good job then get bombarded with all the work. And so then you find yourselves in situations where it's hard to say no because it feels as though giving that project or saying you lead this or we trust you with X feels like a compliment because on the one hand it is, and yet it's still potentially going to cause burnout because then you're holding everything. Right? So then the people that are the most competent then are getting the most work, in essence. And then we use the same services as our clients or live in the same neighborhood. So this is really, again, sort of a boundary in terms of something that you said before, kind of at the beginning, which was when you find yourselves in situations where you have to sort of set that boundary or like, what am I showing about myself or my life? When you all are living and working in similar spaces, holding that boundary or that space of, I don't want you to see all of what my life looks like necessarily for whatever that reason is. And sometimes that's hard to keep, right? So if let's say that we were all living and working in New York City in a particular neighborhood and our clients or colleagues or what have you are all in the same space, holding that boundary might be difficult because of that. What can happen if we don't have good boundaries? So what's the result of not having or setting good boundaries? Now, I recognize some of this might not fit, again, because this is a little bit more clinical in nature. However, I still think it's important to go through. So in a human services space, if people have poor boundaries, this is what potentially can happen. For clients, there might be inappropriate relationships and expectations. There might be exploitation. This is actually in some ways connected to the power differential that we talked about before. And so if there are not boundaries set, then power differentials can lead to exploitation on both sides of clients or staff relationships. Anxiety might be caused because rules are not clear. Again, I would say the same thing for staff. Feelings of confusion, betrayal, or abandonment. Again, and in some ways, even in the roles that you find yourselves in, if there are unclear expectations for clients, then when they believe something to be true and that is not the case, then they're going to feel a particular way about that. So they might feel confused, betrayed, what have you. For staff, again, team splitting, which is really, and actually you all kind of said this a little bit, if boundaries are not clear and expectations are not followed across the board with everyone, if I use the example that you were giving, Glenn, before about a leave or what have you, then one rule applies to one person, but it doesn't apply to someone else. That's a blurry boundary, and that leads to confusion. And again, this idea that there's even potentially favoritism existing in the workplace, and that's not okay. There might be potential for unethical behaviors to occur. And then why we're here today, which is if we don't have boundaries, then you might have compassion fatigue or just fatigue and exhaustion, which can lead to burnout, which is what we're trying to prevent. Another lovely quote here by Olga Kazan, quote, "Boundaries are often thought of as rules for other people, but in reality, they are rules for ourselves. They're our own definition of what we're comfortable with and our own choice about what we'll do if someone ignores the boundary." So really it's about the self. And then we can talk about a little bit about the fact that there are personal relationships and there are professional relationships. And then there's the gray area in between, which is the intersection of personal and professional. Again, if I use the example of, let's say you're working in an environment in which you are the supervisor of a person that you are friends with, or that you were friends first, and then the relationship changed at work, what does that mean? And so that's a gray area. And what that might impact is how much you're sharing about yourself. If I keep going with this friend example, your friend might already know something about you before roles change. And so then what does that mean? Or they might be able to talk to you in a different way. Is that something that you want to be happening at work or not, right? So conversations have to happen in order to clarify what's expected when the gray area is engaged, right? There might be gray areas around, again, comfort with physical contact. What about receiving or offering presents to people? Again, this idea of dual or overlapping relationships. I said this before, living in the same community as your clients or your colleagues, going above and beyond for a client or a colleague. What I would say here is one of the things that I find really helpful in terms of deciding what I'm going to do or not do. The question becomes, especially in a professional environment, if I'm going to offer something to a client or a colleague, am I going to be able to offer that something to all clients and all colleagues? And if I can't, then am I setting a precedent that I can't then fulfill? Right? So that's an example of this question of, am I going above and beyond for someone? If I am, can I do that for everybody? And if I can't, then I'm setting myself up for something there. Over-identifying with client issues or situations. That's another sort of boundary to notice. Am I having a reaction to something and it's an unexpected reaction, or am I over-identifying with a problem? That's something to consider. And then rules around things like social media, especially nowadays. How do you work in the gray area? You want to, again, look at your guidelines, organizational policies, ethical guidelines, if you have them in your role. Self-awareness, which we'll talk about more in a second. Clear and transparent communication. So boundary setting is about communicating. And then supervision and self-care. So this discussion about crossing boundaries and what that might mean. We discussed, again, warning signs of burnout and how this connects to awareness. I will say, coming back to something that you were saying, Shanasia, there's a difference between internal self-awareness and external self-awareness. So internal is the recognition and understanding of one's internal states, preferences, emotions, and thoughts and needs. External self-awareness is pertaining to understanding how others might perceive us in various contexts and situations, helping us navigate social situations. I just wanted to name that that's included. And then as I move us along, we talked about warning signs of burnout, what your signs are. I wanted to pause here, which is with this quote from one of my colleagues that loves to use this in terms of self-care. By the time you feel thirsty, you're already dehydrated. So this question mark about being aware and knowing your warning signs, part of it is preventing you from getting to the point of the emotion that you've been suppressing coming out, or the filter being completely off. Those things are happening because you're already dehydrated. And so the reason that we talk about awareness when we're talking about boundaries is that you want to be mindful and recognize in yourself when you are creeping into that space so that you are actually reaching for a glass of water before you're dehydrated. So let's first talk about what happens when a boundary is crossed, right? So what if we think about ourselves first? What happens if I crossed a boundary? And so now what do? So someone set a boundary with me and I've crossed it. So first, which I think I said before already, have grace for yourself. We're human. We are exhausted depending on the space. The world is falling apart. These things are happening. We're not living in a vacuum, right? So you first want to acknowledge the lives that you are living and the life and the space in which you are living, what you are inhabiting. So be kind to yourself. Recognize that boundaries are hard. If a boundary has been crossed in your professional spaces, talk with a supervisor or a colleague. Make sure that you're not isolating, because oftentimes when we isolate, it's because we're feeling shame about something. And the best way to move through that is to seek empathy. The only way to seek that is by naming the thing that's going on, which really is asking you to be vulnerable and saying, oh, this happened and ouch has happened and I need to talk about it. And actually, this is the same in personal spaces from my perspective. Examine your motivations for crossing a boundary. A perfect example of this is, let's say that you've set a boundary with a client or a colleague and they don't know a particular part of your life. but for whatever reason, it seems appropriate to you to share a little bit more, that's you crossing a boundary, but you just want to be mindful of why you're choosing to do that. That there's always an intention behind the choices that you're making, so it doesn't just feel like it's blurry for no reason, right? So you just want to be mindful of those motivations or the reasons behind your choice. Lean back on your policies. Again, and boundaries crossed, but let's go back to policies and what we know to be true on paper. And if a client's needs are consistently not being met, discuss with your supervisor or colleague instead of filling the gaps by yourself. Really, the focus is remember, especially in professional spaces, that you're not doing this alone. Again, I would say the same for personal. When you're walking through this process, ask yourself, if I want to go back and repair what's happened, how could this go wrong? Sort of be prepared for the worst case scenario in one way. Recognize that when you're thinking about a client or a colleague, it's their job to get their needs met. So they're performing or acting from that space. To be clear is to be kind, so set clear expectations for everyone involved. Stay kind and firm, avoid inciting shame, which we'll talk about more in a second. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. This kind of speaks to what I said before about setting a precedent. So when you've set boundaries, you've set expectations. If you choose to cross them, be mindful of your intention and about the fact that you are then potentially setting a precedent. And that might be okay, but just be mindful that if you're choosing to do it, you might be setting a precedent. You want to be able to talk about that later. Or if you're having a moment and not sure, think about the fact that just because you can does not mean that you always should do it. This is a quote again from another colleague, to remind ourselves, and this is again in professional and personal spaces, you are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Let's breathe through that. Yes. Again, just a reminder that this is not a requirement. I think the other thing that I want to remind us of in this space, in terms of us as women of color, us as people that want to build up our communities and each other, that does not mean that you also always have to give, right? You can also be in a space of receiving, which I recognize that maybe we're not used to, or maybe the roles that we have been handed or the roles that we're comfortable with, what have you. I don't have enough time to go deeper into that, but I just want to name that that is potentially the case, right? And to remind us that we don't necessarily have to do that all the time. And to remind us of this as well. The only people who get upset about you setting boundaries are the people that are benefiting from you not having any. Setting boundaries and how you can become confident in doing so and trusting yourselves in doing this. So here I go again with the same questions. When you're about to set a boundary, ask yourself, how could this go wrong? Think about when you're about to set a boundary, ask yourself, how could this go wrong? I should have added, how could this go right? So what is the benefit of setting a boundary in this space, right? What is the benefit here? Ask yourself, or actually remind yourself, it is my job to get my needs met by communicating them. The thing that I've added here is, in order to have your needs met, you have to communicate. The precursor to that is I have to be aware of what my boundaries are, right? So we started with awareness of self, because in order to communicate what I need, I have to know what I need. In order to communicate my boundary, I have to know what that boundary is. And then I have to be willing and able to communicate it. You want to be clear, because to be clear is to be kind. So have clear expectations when you're setting this boundary. What are the boundaries? What are the expectations that I want to set forth? Stay kind and firm. Avoid inciting shame or blame. So if I go back to this idea of expecting that people are doing the best they can, when you find yourself in the need to set a boundary with someone because something has been crossed, think about the fact that they are showing up with you and for you. And if you think about their best self or them doing something with what they know, your purpose in communicating a boundary is giving them more information rather than blaming them for behaving in a particular way, especially if you've never had the conversation about how a boundary has been crossed. Does that make sense? Okay. And then 5, remember, which I said before, but I just want to reaffirm. Remember that while you're setting a boundary with another person or within an organization, often this is really about communicating your needs to A, honor yourself, despite, which is a thing that I think is a little bit difficult when we're talking about boundaries, despite how you setting a boundary might be received by another person. So I think oftentimes when we think about boundaries, some people might sort of come to that space with, I don't want to do this because it doesn't matter. Because no matter what I say, people are not going to do what I'm asking. People don't care about my needs. Those kinds of ways of thinking about it. I also recognize that that happens for very real and important reasons. And yet, I guess my invitation to you all as a person that practices this and is a practitioner of helping people set boundaries is that the first person that you're actually honoring and taking care of when you do this is you. And there's power in that. And there's actually, what I would also add to this is that you are refueling yourself by honoring what you need. So simply by stating it, thinking about it, even talking to your friends about it or colleagues about it, you are in essence honoring yourself because you are, coming back to something that you all said at the very beginning, validating your experience. So boundaries that you might need are emotional boundaries around inappropriate topics, emotional dumping, when someone that you love or someone that you work with is saying so much that maybe you're not in a space to carry it all or to listen to it all, that's okay. You can say things like, I can't be present for you right now, but I would like to be later. Or I want to talk about this, but I only want to be able to talk about this and this. Or to quote the slide, this isn't a topic I'm willing to discuss. And I'd like to say that to you. And P.S. in addition to that, if you find yourselves in a situation like that and people continue to talk about it, then you walk away. Another boundary is time and energy. Boundaries around time or lateness or being on time. What does that mean? Thinking about factors. Some of us have a different relationship with time. I'm often telling people this is one of my differences in professional spheres and personal spheres. Professionally, of course, I will be in a meeting on time, no question. Personally, I'm typically telling the people that I love that everything is with an ish at the end. I will be there at 4:30-ish. I will be there at 7-ish. Don't wait for me because I don't want you to wait for me. Right? Just to give example. And that is something I will also say as a Latina that I had to learn to communicate very much to my white friends. And or if my mother heard me say that, she would say that in Bolivian culture, people are on time as well, that it is not just a white culture thing. And what I would argue back with her is that, there are some European and British tendencies that permeated Bolivian culture, and then that's a whole nother conversation. But again, the example being that there are boundaries around how we all show up in terms of our time and our energy. There are also mental boundaries, so freedom to have your own thoughts, beliefs, values, opinions. Quote, I respect that you disagree with my opinion, but don't force yours on me. Also very, that feels like a boundary that is very aligned with cultural humility, which I also think is really important. Other boundaries that you might need have to do with materials. This always makes me think about my best friend. And she talks about how she's a teacher and she doesn't like people touching her stuff. And sometimes people don't understand that. So she has a lab, and why are people touching my Petri dishes and those kinds of things, right? But again, people have different boundaries. And so that might be a boundary around material things. For example, in this quote, my car cannot be used on weekends. Thank you so much, but sorry, it's not available. And then you have physical boundaries, which we touched on a little bit, right? So proximity, physical touch. It might also be something about unwanted comments about people's bodies, those kinds of things. I also use that as an example because I think in this day and age, given the rise of social media and how we all talk about our lives, sometimes that makes it feel as though that's an entry point or entryway into comments. And so it is, again, important to name those boundaries for yourselves and for other people. In summary, we talked about the what and the why of boundaries, self-awareness and boundaries, and how you might set boundaries and how important it is to honor yourselves. Quote by Tony Gaskins, you teach people how to treat you by what you allow, what you stop, and what you reinforce.